Okay, we'll start in about 1 minute. So we're going to talk about the coursework first, and just to kind of go through some examples from previous years and to give you a bit of guidance on it. Can I just check, and I might regret doing this, how many people have actually used the Rise app? So very few. Really, if you want to do well in the coursework, I suggest you have a look at it. There's a lot of material on there on the kinds of things that you're being asked to look at. So, you know, if you don't, you're missing an opportunity. It's not going to give you the answers, but it will certainly kind of give you a kind of concise version of some of the theory. And so this morning, there were still 2 teams that hadn't wrapped. So one team hadn't wrapped the previous week. So not really much, not very sure what we can do to kind of convince you that it's a good idea to wrap on time. But that's fine. Everybody else did, so well done for that. Okay, so let's make a start. So I'm just going to go through a bit about the coursework. You know what you have to do. I know some of you are still a bit confused about stuff. In fact, I was behind 2 people on the bus on Friday talking about it, and I sort of turned around and scared them. And so I heard what you said, and I think they were a bit concerned that there was a lot of theory that they had to try and cram into not very many words. Okay, so really you have to kind of narrow your discussion and talk about specifics. Okay, you can't get all the theory that you need to get into 2,000 words. So let's just go through and talk about some of the things that you might want to look at. These lecture notes are available now on Blackboard. So don't start, I mean, you can if you want, but there's no point. Don't start sort of taking pictures of screens, because you've got all this available to you on the notes in PDF and PowerPoint form. Okay, so just in case anybody hasn't looked at the coursework yet, well, good luck. It's on Blackboard, and the hand-in date is the 11th of August. So we keep saying, don't wait until the game is finished. You don't need to. It doesn't matter, really. It doesn't matter how well you've done in the game as to, you know, what you write about in your coursework. You could write about it this week. It doesn't matter how well you do afterwards. I mean, actually, writing the coursework might give you some thoughts about decision-making approaches or things that you might want to think about in the next couple of quarters, but don't leave it to the last minute. Now, in terms of extensions, because I know we're going to get questions on this, because we always do, we don't grant extensions because that's not within our power. It's the usual thing. If you want an extension, you have to ask the hub. Okay, so don't ask us. We can't help. That doesn't mean to say you can't have one. It's just that we cannot grant them. So that's a power that was taken away from us some years ago, unfortunately. Okay, so again, this is the lecture we do every year. Of course, I've changed it to reflect what we're asking you to do this year, so it's a bit different. So again, you're thinking about how you're going to squeeze all of these theories, all of this discussion into 2,000 words. Well, it's going to be tough, but it's a skill that is very, very valuable, being able to say a lot in a little. Okay, so when you choose your examples from the game, choose something really specific, like quarter 4, I don't know, thinking about your projected demand. That could be the example. Think about the theories specifically relevant to that issue, what you did or what you should have done. You know, there's lots of other stuff you could discuss, but you're not going to have space to discuss it all. So you really have to be very succinct. And I'm going to go through some bits and pieces that people do that just waste so many words that you don't need to waste it on. Okay, so I'll go through that. So it's a synthesis of theory and practice. I would say probably, and there's no right proportion, probably about 60% theory, 40% practice, 50-50, something along those lines. Okay, so it really has to be synthesized. So when people say, well, how do I do this? Do I do the theory first and then the practice? Or do I write about them kind of interwoven? Well, either way, probably the latter, where you kind of have you talk about theory and the practice and talk about the effect of one on the other, probably better, because it just allows you to show that you understand how they kind of fit together. So just minimize the number of examples from the game, all right? So I keep saying this, but rather than give us, for instance, this much width in terms of examples that you give us and give us that much depth on each, we'd rather you chose really narrow examples and give us theoretical depth. Okay, so you can say, look, this issue that happened, I kind of know now what we did and how I can theorize that, how the theory relates to that, and I also know or have some ideas about what we could have done better. Or it might be that you did it really well, in which case you need to discuss why. You might just have been lucky. I'm not suggesting that's the case, but you might have been lucky. You might have said, I don't know, we just did it this way, and that turned out to be the right way. But that doesn't mean to say that you kind of knew why. Yeah?
Would it be a good idea to choose maybe two examples and then write a couple of paragraphs on each, or would that be too few?
I think it depends on what you want to say, really. So I think I'll go through this bit by bit, okay? So I'll give you some kind of more guidance on that. But yeah, I mean, really, very narrow examples. Again, we'll go through this. Right, now, normally, somebody would say, right, I want an executive summary. Well, stuff that. I couldn't care less about the executive summary, only because it's not that it's not important. It's just that in this particular bit of coursework, you haven't got time. I'm not going to mark, well, we're not going to mark you down if you do, but what that means is you're taking away valuable space from the discussions later on. So I know that you're probably thinking, well, each lecturer has a different set of requirements for a report. It's just that we know that you've got a lot to try and cram in, and that really does take away a lot of words, okay? Now, do you write in the first person? I did this, we did that, or in the third person, the team did this? Well, we don't really care too much. I suppose technically the third person is the better way of doing it. And if you're going to talk about members of your team, particularly in a kind of negative way, you might just want to refer to them as team member 1, team member 2. Okay, I mean, obviously we're not going to tell people what you said because it's all anonymous, right? But we just want you to kind of, I don't know, just do it professionally. Okay, so team member 1, team member 2, team member 1 had this particular issue that affected coursework, the decision making in a particular way. Okay, so just keep it kind of, what's the word? Confidential, neutral.
Just a very quick comment. Don't put your name in the submission. Don't put it. We try to mark anonymously. Put your student ID number. That's it. Not your name. Never ever, when you're in a university, put your name. It's very important. Okay? Thank you.
Yeah, particularly if we know that you support the wrong football team, because that obviously could have a dramatic effect on your mark. That was a joke, by the way. Just thought I'd get that over with. So yeah, just don't put your name on there. We do see people put names, and obviously if we know who you are, it doesn't matter. What we're going to mark is what's actually in the report, but it's just for purposes of confidentiality, you just put your student number. Okay, so you've got 2,000 words, and you can go 10% either way. Now, obviously, given that you're trying to, you're fighting really against a fairly tight word count, we would expect you to go over rather than under. Okay, so you can go to 2,250. The references do not count as part of that word count. It'd be a bit harsh if you had 30 references and that counted. It doesn't, okay? And actually, just on that point, we'll talk about references a bit later on. How many references should I put, you ask, okay? Because that comes up a lot. And we say, as many as you need to do the job properly. If you've got fewer than 10, we're suspecting that maybe you're not introducing enough theory. But between 10 and 20 would be kind of normal. More than that, fantastic. But we do actually check to see what the references are. I mean, for instance, I was talking about this weekend and saying that occasionally you have people with references like the Journal of Pig Management. I'm thinking, not overly relevant, to this particular assignment. But anyway, so wherever your references come from is fine, but just make sure that they're relevant. And obviously make sure that they are reputable sources. So Wikipedia, no, although that might be a good starting point to find out what the references that they recommend could be, because it's a good starting point to say, right, I want to find out about a subject, and it's a good starting point to give me some leads into what theories, what academics actually talked about this kind of stuff. But obviously don't use Wikipedia or something similar as a direct source. So we don't want to be too prescriptive about the kind of structure of the report, but all I'd say is this, right? We're marking, not just us two, but Tony Polak as well, something about 330 of these. So it will be really great if occasionally one comes up and you think, oh, thank heavens, they've structured it in a way which is easy to mark. We can see whether they've covered particular subjects, you know, and you instantly feel much better disposed towards that piece of work. So this is a kind of structure that we could recommend, but it's up to you. Just think about the marker, all right? The person who has to sit through and try and work out, has this person actually talked about this? Because it's a bit ambivalent, a bit vague as to whether they have. So an introduction, just a very brief introduction. Something that people often do is, Marketplace is a game where, yeah, we know that. You know that, we know that. You don't have to talk about what Marketplace is, okay? But you might just want to say, this report will look into, you know, these issues. Maybe a small paragraph would be enough, okay? So really, and also, don't talk about business in general. Just be specific to this assignment. The second part, and I'll come on to this a bit later on, are the two decision-making approaches that you're going to discuss, or the two examples. Okay. The third one is about uncertainty. And I've listed some things here that you might want to use as your kind of main theory. So it could be satisficing. You say, well, you know, we could talk about the uncertainty which meant that we had to satisfice. We talk about bounded rationality, maybe, this idea that you don't have access to all the information that you need because, as you know, you don't. Okay, so how could you explain that particular situation that you faced theoretically? Okay, if it was bounded rationality, talk about it. You know, why did it affect this particular issue? What is bounded rationality? What could you do next time, if anything, to overcome it? And if you couldn't, then explain that bounded rationality isn't curable, you can't solve it, but maybe there are tools and techniques that make it slightly less of a problem. Now, this third one is something ordinarily you'd find under the cultural dimensions, okay? But one of the cultural dimensions we're not asking you to mention in that part 4 is uncertainty avoidance. Now, that's the level to which a particular culture tries to embrace or avoid uncertainty. Okay, so because we're not asking you about that in the last part, then you want to talk about how uncertainty avoidance was present in your team because of cultural differences, or maybe a single culture that really avoids uncertainty and therefore these problems arose, or this problem arose, then that's absolutely fine. And sorry, that next bit, individualism versus collectivism, forget that. That's something that you would mention potentially in that 4th part. But also, I was looking through back a couple of years ago when this game was done entirely remotely because of COVID. And sorry, just checking there's someone talking, isn't there? Good. Okay, so there were issues caused by, or uncertainty issues caused by working remotely. Now, of course, some of you, those of you doing this remotely, all 21 of you at the moment, which is good, may have said, well, actually, something that happened to us wouldn't have happened if we'd been together in a room the way that you guys out there are. Okay, so if you want to talk about uncertainty caused by working remotely, now, of course, some of you, even though you're present here, your team members are stuck in London with full-time jobs or whatever, you know, whatever the problem is. In which case, you might have said, well, I've looked into this, and actually there is uncertainty caused by not working together. maybe issues of lack of trust, maybe a sort of anonymity thing where somebody can just kind of sit out of the the actual kind of teamwork, and thereby causing some kind of uncertainty. Again, you've just got to make sure that if you choose that one, that you say, well, there is uncertainty caused by working remotely or not working in the same place. Anyway, or any other issue that you think led to uncertainty that you want to discuss theoretically. Okay, so again, don't feel as though you only are constrained to work within the theory that you've been taught in that lecture by Tony or that's available on Rise. You can talk about whatever you want, so long as you make sure that it's relevant to the issue that you're describing, the actual example. Okay? And furthermore, what you would do to overcome it, if at all possible. So don't, if you said, I can't write about that because it isn't something we can do anything about. No, you can write about that, but you might want to sort of further explore why you can't do anything about it and how there's nothing that you would have done differently next time. Okay, so don't worry too much if it's something that cannot be solved. If it could be solved, presumably this wouldn't be the major issue that it is. Because bounded rationality is quite a well-known theory. If it was solvable, probably would have been sort of, wouldn't be mentioned for the last 50 years, but we don't think it is. So it's something that you might want to explore. And then the cultural dimensions. So again, you might want to mention, well, any two of those four. So long-term versus short-term, power distance, femininity versus masculinity, individualism and collectivism. So again, you want to know what those are, go to the Rise app or look at some of the work of Hofstede. I think he's got his own website. There's lots of examples there. Okay, I'll talk a bit further about this because there are some other bits and pieces that you might want to think about. Okay, the conclusion. The conclusion is optional in a way. I mean, you just want to conclude that, conclude what you've written, but you don't need to spend more than a short paragraph doing that. Okay? And the references, which I've already mentioned. Now, references, not bibliography. You know the difference, right? Yeah. Okay, so the difference is, so I was reading a book last night, doesn't matter what it was, and in the back is the bibliography. So those are all the kind of references, all the sources, if you like, that author used or that writer used to talk about what they're talking about. But nowhere in that book do you know where any of those particular sources were drawn upon. So it's really just stuff that guided you. References are when you actually cite a particular author saying, so-and-so said this, or as can be found in the report written by so-and-so, this happened. So references are you saying, all of these bits I can kind of link to a particular author or a particular report. Okay, so I'll go into a bit more of that later on. I mean, obviously, if you put down bibliography, we're not going to fail you, but you won't get as many marks just because you haven't listened. All right, so just make sure that you don't make that simple mistake. So this is something that, as a flowchart, that I thought was a good way of maybe structuring that first question of two instances where you made decisions and it may have been that the approach you took, you might not even have known what the approach was, but now you've looked into it, you realize the approach that you took was X. And then you've got to judge whether or not that was the better way of making that decision. So whatever the approach number one was, the first example, was it the correct approach for that decision? If it was, okay, fine. Where's the evidence? You can't just say, yes, it was the correct approach without justifying why that's the case. Okay? So what was the example of the decision in the game? Okay? If it was a conscious choice by you to take this particular approach, like a rational or intuitive, then justify why you chose it and justify why it turned out to be the most appropriate approach. You might say, well, in this type of decision, this type of approach of decision making is what everybody thinks is the most appropriate way. Okay? If it wasn't a conscious choice, then you might just say, look, we were lucky. So explain, why this turned out to be the most appropriate approach. You just got to show knowledge of why that approach for that particular decision. And then you might want to say, well, were there other approaches that you could have taken? So it was the correct approach, but you might want to then talk about maybe a couple of other decision-making approaches that you could have chosen, and then talk about why they wouldn't have been appropriate. Okay, so you might say, well, I could have chosen the intuitive approach, but that was wrong because blah. And now you're showing a kind of much deeper amount of knowledge about another approach. But if the approach you took wasn't correct, it was a disaster, and you've only learned that after you've taken it, then again, evidence. You know, what was the example? Was it a conscious choice? Was it some, you know, what was your rationale for choosing it? Explain why it turned out to be wrong. Explain why it turned out to be the wrong approach. And then talk about what approach you should have chosen instead. Or, you know, there may be 3 or 4 different approaches you could have chosen, but just choose one, because you haven't got time to do it justice to all 3 or 4 of them. Okay? So if you just follow that kind of flow chart, you can't go too far wrong. Don't forget, if you admit that you've made a complete hash of a particular decision, it doesn't matter, so long as you can explain what went wrong, why, and what you should have done. Okay? So in a funny kind of way, the more things that go wrong in the game, the more you've got to write about. So, any questions on that? If you want to bring in a theory that we haven't mentioned that you think would have been the best way of doing it, that's absolutely fine. And what it shows us is you've actually bothered to go out there and look at this kind of stuff and find something that may be really specific to exact circumstances that you found yourself in and said, that's the approach we should have taken. It's rarely used. Maybe it's only ever used in kind of student teams, but that was the approach we should have chosen. Fine, not a problem. But just justify it. Okay? And I think I've mentioned this before, and sorry for sort of hammering this home. We don't want to see people say things like, as we all know, because we don't unless you tell us. Now, the reason I say that is because I have that expression, we have that expression so many times in this, as if by saying that, the author doesn't need to actually justify themselves. Well, you really do. Okay? Okay, okay, we talked a little bit about the uncertainty earlier on. So what was the uncertainty present? So, you know, what was the game example? The game example was this thing where there was a lot of uncertainty. Okay? So talk about, why is there uncertainty? What causes the uncertainty? Is it a lack of information? Is it the fact that people are kind of geographically dispersed? Can you talk about, I mean, if you can, talk about, this is good, isn't it? Oh, there we are. Okay. What kind of uncertainty it is? Can you actually categorize what kind of uncertainty we're talking about? So what are the theories that explain why that uncertainty happens? Again, it might be bounded rationality, it might be satisficing, it might be something totally different. So is it something that is typically expected in such situations? You know, it might be you realize that, actually, looking at this, in these kind of academic examples, this kind of uncertainty is always present because maybe you guys don't have the business experience that people out there would have. Okay? It doesn't matter. It's not like we're kind of criticizing you for that, but you might want to say that's the kind of uncertainty we're dealing with, and it happens a lot in these circumstances. So, and then once you've described that, and you've kind of interwoven the theory and the practice, and we'll talk about some examples, you say, right, okay, well, now I know about this, what could we have done, if anything, that could have overcome that problem, that could have minimized the uncertainty? Okay, you might want to say something like, well, I don't know, 6 thinking hats would have helped because it would have allowed us to see this problem from multiple different perspectives. Or there's another theory, another tool and technique that could have been chosen to minimize it. Or you say, we can't. And here's why. You know, there isn't an answer, there isn't a solution to it, and this is the reason why it's impossible to overcome. So again, you're just showing a really good depth of knowledge in that example, in that theory that you've chosen to focus on. So the third one, so the cultural dimension, you've got to choose 2. So for instance, in that top left-hand corner, we'll choose example 1, whatever that happened to be. So maybe it's individualism, collectivism. So I suppose you've got to ask yourself, right, are we a single culture in our team? If you are, okay, then maybe what you want to discuss is the fact that you maybe all think the same way. But you might say, well, that's not true. I've been in this country maybe 10 years and I don't think that way. I've kind of maybe moved towards a slightly different way of thinking because of exposure to the Western, Western approaches. So actually, yes, we are a single culture, but there are still issues, despite the fact we've all been slightly Westernized maybe, that there are certain issues that we have that cause blind spots. Things that lead to things like groupthink, okay? So what were those blind spots? Explain it theoretically. How does Hofstede or similar other academics describe this? So how did it affect the decision making? Okay, so discuss, the example you're going to choose in that. So individualism, collectivism, in this particular example, how did our cultural makeup affect decision making? Is that something the theory says? Are you experiencing something different from the theory? Can you explain why that's the case? So if that's the case, then what methods might there be to overcome those blind spots? And by blind spots, I'm not being critical of a culture. I'm just saying that if Alfonso and I did something together, we'd probably have particular ways of thinking about it, and we might not think about other ways. And if somebody had said, have you thought about looking at it this way? We'd have said, oh, okay, that's interesting. Yeah, maybe we should. But until someone points it out, we wouldn't necessarily do that. Okay, so, okay, I think I've doubled up there. So what methods might you have chosen next time to overcome those blind spots? If your culture is made up of different cultures, sorry, your team is made up of different cultures, then what were the cultures? Usually, well, there are 5 different people in our group. Each of them comes from a different culture. I haven't got time to describe them all, but maybe there are 2 different cultures that clashed and caused this particular problem in this particular example. So maybe you want to focus on those 2. Okay, so you might say, right, what were the cultures and what were the scores? So if you look at Hofstede, he gives scores ranging, I think, from 0 to 100 on that particular dimension for that particular culture. So it might be that one has a score of 90 and one has a score of 10. Big difference in whatever that dimension happens to be. So very different ways of seeing the same problem. Okay, so if there was tension, what was the impact of that tension? Is that consistent with the theory? Is that something you'd have expected to see? And then you can talk about the ways around that problem if you did it again. Okay, so maybe there are tools and techniques or approaches that you'd have chosen. If there wasn't tension, it might be that you did things a certain way that prevented that tension from happening. Maybe you had particular ways of working as a group that actually prevented that tension from happening. In which case, what were they? What did you do? Okay. So was no tension a good thing? Maybe you can have too much harmony in a team. So lots of things you could discuss if you wanted to, and that kind of gives you a kind of template maybe to guide your thinking. All right. I think this bit is the most interesting because I just think the differences in cultures are fascinating. Okay, but you probably want to look at the marks allocated to these questions and proportion the amount of time you take to be consistent with the marks available. Occasionally you get somebody who writes huge amounts of stuff for 10 marks and about half of that for 30 marks. It doesn't make any sense. So just try and be consistent. Okay, any questions on that? Was that reasonably clear? Yeah. Yeah. Actually, what I did is I kind of mentioned this, and I realised that when I was doing this last week, so you can basically forget that. I shouldn't have put that in there, okay? So, because that appears or could appear in the cultural dimensions. Having said that, given that the markers are here, you might say, well, I'm not going to discuss individualism and collectivism under part 4 because I've got 2 other ones I want to discuss. In which case, if you think uncertainty was caused by individualism and collectivism, you could, I suppose, mention it under part 3. Okay? So all I'm saying is don't mention it twice. Okay? So well done. Thanks for pointing that out. That's a good point, and I think that's. But thinking about it again, you could mention that, provided you don't mention it in part 4. Okay, so what we don't want to see. Okay, now again, we always do this because there are still people that do it. So we don't want to see. We did say to you at the start of the game, you might want to have a diary you keep, just to remember some of the issues that you had, which you might want to draw upon later on for your examples. But you don't have to hand that in. We don't need to have a long discussion of what decisions you actually took. Because really, it's not the decisions themselves that matter, it's the way you took them. And we sometimes have this. In quarter 1, we did in quarter 2, we did, yeah, fascinating, but we don't want that, okay? We don't really care what markets and segments you entered and dropped out of, or how much money you made, unless that's one of the examples you're going to use for whichever section you care to discuss it in. Okay, so we don't care about how wealthy you were at the end. All we care about is kind of the process, how you took some of those decisions. Now again, last week, somebody obviously actually looked at this, which was amazing, and said on the coursework, and said, Gibbs reflective cycle. Can I not use this? I said, well, not really, because Gibbs reflective cycle, although it clearly is a way of reflecting upon something, which is what you're being asked to do, that then encourages you to do things that we don't want you to do here. Okay? So we're not saying you can't use that to kind of maybe think about the way that you might want to tackle a couple of issues, but don't follow that cycle, because it will just lead you down a path that gets you very few marks, because it's not what we want. Okay? So, or even anything similar than Gibbs. Just don't do that, because it will kind of put you into bad habits. Okay, so examples of bad work. Now, genuinely, these are some of the examples we had. Bear in mind that over the past 10 years, the coursework has changed a bit. We used to ask as much about team working as we did about decision making, and then we said, well, actually, team working is something that's been covered elsewhere, and really, in the space you have available, you haven't got time to do it in great depth. So we then moved on to just decision making. So just bear that in mind when we look at some of these. So, a fascinating, a very moving account of risk management in an enterprise. Absolutely not what we're after. So the only point of putting that in is RTFQ. I know you can probably guess what F stands for. The rest of it is read the question. That's not what we're after. I think this was a person who decided they didn't need to take part in any of the things like the team working, and just write something that happened to be vaguely relevant to what the game was looking at, and they got 0. So our predecessor, Ian Brodie, who used to run this, was not a man that had much patience for anything that wasn't being asked for. So just read the question, okay? What are you being asked to look at? And just keep it very, very narrow. Now this one was when we were asking about teamwork. Okay, so here, you know the thing about forming, storming, norming, and performing. We're not after this. That's about teamwork. You might reference the fact that during a storming phase, we had one particular problem, one example where we had maximum conflict. See, it's not like you can't mention it, but they just decided to give a whole discussion on all of these 4 phases without putting any examples in. And it was supposed to be about examples. Now, those of you who've got team members that are, how should we put this, lazy and not taking part, and you're thinking, but we've done all the work, and yet they're getting some of the glory, believe me, when it comes to writing this report, we'll find people like that out, because they won't be able to write examples that make any sense, because they won't have played the game. So there is some justice in the world. Okay, so examples. Don't give us lots of theory unless it's relevant. So for instance, if you said, well, there are 5 phases, yeah, forget that. What is the phase that matters in this example? Okay. Okay, so here, have a read of this. What is missing here? Admittedly, this is only a chunk, okay, of a piece of work, but it didn't improve. What's missing, do you think? Theory. No theory. So this is what we would call descriptive. I did this, then we did this, then we did this, then we did this. Yeah, great, lovely, but you're not theorizing it. You're not explaining what happened, why it happened, what could have happened at all. It's just descriptive. So that is not going to get you a pass. So again, those people who aren't putting the effort in, they'll get found out, all right, because they won't be able to attach relevant theory to it. Same things here, okay? So in quarter 5 and 6, I decided to do this, then we did this. So this is all about what they did rather than the kind of theory behind why they did what they did. Okay, so again, it's, earlier I said that you could have the practice and then the theory, but really they're much better interwoven. And I'll give you some examples later on of how that might look. So don't forget, there is an example, a past example, a good example from a previous year, I think a previous kind of version of the coursework on Blackboard. So I suggest you look at that to see what a really good interweaving of theory and practice would look like. A good example, okay? Now, can I just point out, I'm going to go back. These references are completely made up. Okay, there is not an academic, as far as we know, called Vice Pope Eric. There isn't one called Aardvark. So just bear it in mind. If we see them in the marking, we'll know that the point hasn't been made. Okay. So here we are. I've just made this up, right? So in hindsight, our decision on whether to select Europe or Asia as a suitable market was seen as a routine decision. All right. So obviously discuss what a routine decision is. However, once the decision had been taken, it became obvious that it was in fact closer to an adaptive decision because of these characteristics. Okay, so you're saying, look, we know why. That is now seen as maybe a different sort of decision because things have moved on, the variables have changed, became more complex, yada, yada, yada. So this is where groupthink tends to dominate. Okay, Stalin and Voles are those two famous academics, and where different cultures differ strongly on uncertainty avoidance. Okay, so again, you're bringing in theory and practice and saying, well, this happened because of that theory, or that theory could be illustrated by that piece of practice. Next time, we would use the XXXX approach. So again, all this is me just kind of letting my imagination run riot, okay? But you can see the kinds of thing we're after here. So just bear in mind, the references don't really exist. So these are chunks of a really good piece of work. Okay, so have a read of this. Again, it's only sort of taken out of context, so it's difficult to see the bigger context, but just have a read of that. Now, this doesn't necessarily apply to all of you. I mean, obviously they face particular problems. And I'm not saying that was perfect, but it's just, it was a good way of explaining the problems that they faced were down to bounded rationality. They might have started off thinking that it was a very rational decision they were making. They had all the information they felt they needed. And then as the game became more complex and they were dealing with the uncertainties of, you know, I wonder what these competitors did. Or I wonder what the price will be next time, because you had the information you had right at the start, the market research, and that was maybe seen to be a rational decision. You had all you needed, and then you realized actually it wasn't that rational. Okay, so they've explained that reasonably well. Okay, so here they talk about employing the satisficing strategy by, so this is something that, don't forget that when you choose your factory simulation, you say, Alfonso, what should be the best target point and replenishment point and all that kind of stuff? We don't know. So what you've got to try and do is you've got to try and run that simulation as many times as you can and find what looks to be an acceptable solution, because you can't go on forever. And that would be seen to be satisfying. You're dealing with uncertainty by saying, look, we're not trying to find the optimal solution, but we're happy that we'll choose one that is kind of good enough. Okay? And although it produced kind of quick and fairly simple decisions, you know, using these heuristics, using these kind of rules of thumb to make that decision may lead to low quality. So again, bring in the theorists that talk about the problems of using satisficing. Okay, so again, an example of how they brought the theory and practice together. Okay, here we've got the same with groupthink, so have a read of this. So this may have been an entirely collectivist culture team. Have you covered 6 thinking hats at all? Oh, good. So if you haven't, because you didn't do the module with Fari, then read up about it. It's Edward de Bono, who is, I think, one of the great lateral thinkers, somebody who has come up with this approach called 6 thinking hats, which is a way of saying, right, in a team, we're going to wear a metaphorical colored hat, which allows us or forces us to think in a particular way, particular kind of perspective. So the black hat is a way of thinking of a particular problem from a negative point of view. What are the downsides of looking at that problem from that particular way? So this lot said, we all have this particular problem of groupthink because we don't want to be the one that seems to kind of dissent from what everybody else seems to want to do. So it may be best to kind of force people out of that behavior into a way of getting them to think, right, you're going to think of the green, the kind of the positives, the potential, you think of the black, the kind of negatives of it, and that way it's seen to kind of see it from perspectives that kind of overcome the problem of groupthink. Okay, so I'm not saying that's the answer to all your problems, and if you choose 6 thinking hats as a solution to a problem, you've got to justify why it solves that problem. You can't just say, yeah, 6 thinking hats, whatever, that will do. Okay, so you've got to justify it. And you might just say, right, forget all the 6 thinking hats, I'm going to choose the blue hat because that would allow us to do X, or the black hat. Okay, so don't have to go through the entire thing and discuss it in detail. Okay, so here we've got one where the students explain their decision-making norms, the things right at the start. Okay, and you might say, well, actually, that was a really good idea at the start, but then we realize that there are problems caused by that. Okay, so, you know, the approach that we took may have led to groupthink because we chose that approach at the start. We all make decisions collectively, and then you realize that A, it's impossible because the sheer number of things you've got to do, and B, that it may lead to consequences you weren't aware of. And that's great because now you know and you can explain it. Okay, so what looked a good idea at the start turned out not to be. And again, that's something worth reflecting on, potentially, if that was a problem in your group. Okay, so these are just examples of bringing theory and practice together. Okay, so have a look at this one. Okay, so this is about uncertainty avoidance, that one of those cultural dimensions. So this is about uncertainty avoidance and the difference between a Thai student and Vietnamese students. that cause conflict. And again, it might be that this was the dimension where the conflict really was, okay? So again, you might want to choose that. But if you do that, we want to know what the scores are for Thailand and Vietnam and China, for instance, on this particular dimension. And you could show that as a table or as a graph. But what happens if your country is not represented by Hofstede? You say, well, I come from a particular country, but actually the nearest one is China, or the nearest one is India, but it doesn't specifically talk about our country. So you could just say, well, actually, I could bring in some other theorists who look at that same problem that isn't Hofstede, or you could just say, right, well, actually, we are quite close to India, so I'm going to just pretend that I'm Indian simply to kind of illustrate the point, okay? So if you feel you need to go outside of Hofstede's work, you can do, or you can just choose the closest country, okay? Or talk about it more generally. You know, we haven't got a score for, I don't know, Laos, okay? But we are a collectivist people, therefore we would feature high on that. I can't give you the score, but we would feature high, and there was a clash with a very low collectivist, a more individualist style. So, you know, if you have a problem like that, you might want to just talk to us and see what the best way of tackling it might be. Okay, so now this is as much aimed at the English students as it is the international students. Obviously, get your English spelling and grammar checked. Now, obviously, we can't, because we don't know who you are, and we wouldn't be allowed to call you in and say, could you explain that paragraph? We can't understand what's being said. So just make sure that you get it checked for English and grammar so that you can convey your understanding. Because if we can't understand it, we can't just assume that you know what you're talking about, okay? Check that the references conform to the Harvard style. You're not going to fail if you don't, but you'll lose valuable marks, okay? So there are a couple of links there. I mean, UEA has its own Harvard referencing page. I just happen to think that the one at the Imperial College in London is probably the best. Okay, so that says, okay, what sort of reference is it? It's a book. Okay, that's the way you should format the references. Is it a TV program? That's the way to format the references. So that should cover pretty much anything that you need to choose. Okay, so here, for instance, this is what we would see in the actual reference section, Arami and Ghana, okay, with the name of the journal, if it's a journal, in italics. If it's a book, it's the book title in italics. You'll lose marks, you know, very few marks, but you will lose marks if you don't italicize the right bit, okay? We want page numbers. If you're going to cite something, for instance, here we have in the actual text itself, in brackets, Arami and Ghana 2008. Ideally, what we want is also the page number. We're not going to go and check it, but it's just convention to put the page number in addition to the author and the year, okay? So hopefully that kind of makes a bit more sense. I think a summary would be, don't bother with the executive summary. Don't bother putting your diary that you created in the appendix. If you need to put an appendix in, and I really can't see why you would, but you might just want to have some diagram, I would suggest that diagram could go in the main body of the report. Diagrams do not get counted as part of the word count. However, if you put a table in with huge amounts of text, that will count. So you can't get around the word count by putting a table in of 4 pages, okay? So diagrams where you think that they would be required, you know, don't show us the market share of, because it doesn't really matter. You can describe that. You don't have to put a diagram in, okay? The only diagrams really that we want to see would be the diagrams, the graphs showing us the cultural dimensions and the scores. Anything else, really, I can't see why you'd want to do that. So the appendices, we're not going to mark it, but you might just want to put that, maybe a diagram that you feel doesn't go in the actual main body of the report, in which case I would suggest just leave it out, okay? But the appendices do not count as part of the word count. References, not bibliography, and as I've just said, the references in the appendices do not count towards the 2,000 word limit. Okay? Right, so first thing, if you haven't already done so, go to the Rise app and look at the wealth of material on there. Okay? There's lots of stuff. If you ask us a question, we're going to ask you, what does the Rise app say? If you don't know, then we're not going to be that happy about helping you if you haven't helped yourself already. Okay? So well done to those people who have. The rest of you, you might want to look at that because it's going to help. Okay? Giving you some sort of start on the theory. Any other questions? Okay, well, that's good. I mean, we do actually look forward to reading these if they are kind of structured and they show a real depth of knowledge. Now, just to point out, okay, so when it comes to marks, there's this feeling that in social sciences, you don't get more than 80. We don't believe that. So if something is worth 10%, we'll give it 10%. If it's worth 50%, because you've just barely shown enough knowledge to get you through, that's fine. If it's worth 95, 99%, we'll give it that. Admittedly, that's rare, but we have given 90s, where you think, wow, really, really shown a good understanding of why what happened, and what they could have done. Okay? So, you know, all we can do is mark what we see. So just make sure that justification is made explicit. You know, why did you say that? Right, I think that's more than enough of me. We're just going to Alfonso now. Yep, I'm just going to boot up the marketplace. Babs this week, thanks to graduation, I'm guessing, although I don't know exactly why, are slightly messed up, so please check your timetables. There are no labs this afternoon, for instance, for the group that normally has theirs. I think that's now on Thursday, so just please check your timetables. It does mean, however, you've got plenty more time to you know, start thinking about some of the issues in quarter 7. Okay, right. Off you go. So I'll be on. That's right.
Okay. Well, Pat has already told you some of those 2 things didn't drop up, so he needed to do it, and then they have a fine. One of them has got consecutively 2 fines. So in the labs, probably we will look at trying to give some guidance to that team. The team are coming, the members of the team are coming to us, but something is happening. We know who they are, but we need to probably approach them and say, like, look, don't be afraid to take decisions. I think that the problem is taking decisions. Cool. Okay, let me just give it. No, I need to just do it now. And here we go. And oh, it's already recording. Yeah, cool. Great. So let's go for this is your game. Let's choose one of these ones. This one, Glencoe. Let's go with Glencoe. Yep. There we go. Can I cross-check with you if you can see the same screen as I'm showing, please? The remote students, please. Yep, okay, cool. So let's continue. Good. Well, there are many things not many new things, so I will just focus on the things that are changing in order that you can raise your game and start doing the decisions that you need to do, either difficult, soft, or so. Then you need to focus on that. What will I do with here? Let's go to post 7. Industry news is important. Again, so take a look. Now we're in the swing up. Pat and I, we have told you significantly that worldwide there's a swing to increase production. The world has become a better place, and then the companies like you are selling like crazy, and then you will see an exponential growth in this quarter 7 and 8. Don't forget it. And that is confirmed by all of the trend in the specific regions when you're selling your computers and advertising, they go on the up. As usual, Latin America, North America, the regions that are normally close to the reality, the income, better conditions for work and so forth, they're at the head of the other ones. But don't forget that the other ones that in previous quarters were very significantly lower than North America, Latin America, are catching up in terms of sales. Okay, that is very important. All that swing, quarter 7, 8 will be key for you. Pat already repeat that many times. I will need to emphasize, don't forget to expand to different parts of the world, otherwise you will focus in one region that perhaps is not the good thing to do, a good decision to do, especially in quarter 7 and 8 that the sales have exploded for all of you in terms of revenue. I will go strategic planning. Remember, you don't need to do anything about it. Marketing is something that has changed. I can see gladly that I think that this year is the year that most of the teams have invested in research and development. You are not shy, and that is a good thing, because with previous years, previous students, we almost needed to force some students, and the ones who actually got a prize, those were the students that actually did very well and did research and development investment and as well as licensing. This year is great. It's fantastic. Most of them have done it.
One thing about the reasons why previous teams might have not wanted to invest in R&D might have been about having high uncertainty avoidance. Right? So I say, well, but that's 2 to 3 quarters away. I can't even think about that. So again, if that was you, think about why that's the case. Sorry.
Yeah, it's okay. Thank you, Pat. So take a look. This team has already invested in research and development for ultra-fast computer. And everyone, yay, quarter 6. Oh, we invested on that. We've got that feature in our computers. Well, in this quarter, that is not enough. Okay, so now you can have massive power that costs around $10 million. So what do you do with that? It's like, oh my God, that's a lot of money. But again, I will invite you to assess your decisions and to think carefully. If you're selling cost quota and workforce, will you invest in massive computing power? No. It's like trying to buy a car but investing in an electric bike. No, you don't do that. Okay, it's a little bit non-intelligent decision. Okay, so this kind of massive power, for instance, will be used for innovators, travelers, and Mercedes. As you know, these kind of market segments do not have the sweet point above the 70s. You're already, most of the teams are trying to run and then try to catch up these specific characteristics or features that identify those kind of expensive computers. And one of them will be that. So if you're focusing your segments into these 3, Mercedes, innovators, traveler, I will invite you to think, oh, I think that we can invest in that. And if you cannot invest fully, remember that you can have a little bit backup of short-term loan and long-term loans that you can get access to. It's risky decision, but risky business can take to the very high of the business that you're involved, or if you do a bad decision, you will learn from it. And then there are some consequences from it. But I will invite you that you assess with your team members what is the correct thing to do. There are some other things that, what are the one? Yeah, operating system, for instance. If you put in quarter 5 or 6, basic, easy to use, $2 million, $2.7 million. Then there are several versions now to professional high-tech operating system has evolved. Obviously, that specific characteristic need to be tightened to the specific market segments that you're entering or you're manufacturing your computers. So try to do it in a more intelligent way. Talk to your team members, talk to the designer of the brands, talk to the COO or the CEO, and then try to find out what is the best thing that you can carry on. I need to tell you at this moment, one comment that came across last week. In the tutorials, a couple of teams approached me, and then obviously I try to give myself or Pat the best advice we can have. So we haven't been connected to your game. We don't know all of it about it. But what I was surprised that I had to hear it was, well, it's like now we've got a short-term loan of, we asked for a short-term loan of $3 million and a long-term loan for $4 million. And when I do my simulation, I finish with $1,000. So my advice was, and probably Pat will agree with that, so you need to change some things. You cannot have everything. The team told me, oh, we did R&D, we paid better, and then we increase our manufacturing plant, and we do more brands. But if you cannot afford that, I will invite you to reassess your decisions, because otherwise, leaving $1,000 will create an emergency loan, the mafia behind you, you will be lagging behind on your payments for your short term and your long term, and there will be a problem. And then in both of the teams that I advise, they say like, well, you're not telling me what to do. And I say, yeah, that is the point. I don't need to tell you what to do. You're taking your decisions. I am trying to guide you. Oh, that decision sounds a little bit incoherent with your strategy, or I think that put attention to this or put attention to that, but we cannot solve the game for you. Otherwise, I will be putting in my pocket the thousands of Amazon vouchers in my pocket, but it's not for me. It's the experience is for you. That is something that you need to bear in mind, okay? We will try to help you in putting more questions. Have you thought about manufacturing? Have you thought about branding? Is the branding appearing in several places? All of these kind of questions that make you think and then reassess your decisions. Okay, so this has changed a bit in terms of research and development. I will invite you as well as a way of revenue. If you have invested in several R&D features, you can sell them, profit from it. That's what a normal company does. So they acquire a technology. Well, they do and they don't. So if you want to prevent your competitors to actually copy you, you don't sell it, you protect it, you don't patent. Stupid companies do that. Patenting is telling the other companies, look, we have invented here. No, they go for the industrial secrecy, and then no one knows. And when you sign a contract, for example, with Apple, Apple has significantly reduced the amount of patents in the last 10 years. Why? Because some countries in Asia have copied massively what Apple have done, and then the strategy has changed into industrial secrecy. When you go and work for Apple, you sign a contract. If one day we surprise you that you pass some intel information to that people or that company, we will take you to court and probably put you behind bars. That is the strategy of Apple and Google and other top tech companies in Silicon Valley. Good. Moving from investment, licensing, take a look at these guys. Probably one of the best on this game. So they were licensing for. That is a very good example. I've seen some of you already licensing two or three technologies.
which is good because it's a way to get revenue in order to invest in other areas of your company. It's healthy, it's good. Sales channel. I need to go back here to. So when we're talking about this specific economic cycle that is on the up, the game intuitively tries to put you into that gear that the face-to-face sales are a little bit part of the past of the quarter 3 and 4. Quarter 6, 7, and 8, there's a total swing from face-to-face sales to web sales. And please bear that in mind because I still hear some of the students in quarter 6, oh, I need to continue opening office sales in different parts of the world. First of all, that costs a lot of money. But if you open the web sales, it's relatively cheaper. But to manage, obviously, you need to have specific staff to actually pay for those packages. So web sales, again, take a look at your competitors, where your competitors are. And if they're not there, you try to establish a web sales center in there, and then try to make comparisons and position yourselves. It's very important that actually you take a look at, it could be like a secondary way of employing staff, but actually plays a key role in terms of selling. If you've got web support staff, that is a very good indication that those guys can sell to all of the segments that you want to actually sell. There's a dedicated team, yeah, specialized in specific segments, but the web support, when those guys are extremely busy, you've got web support there to actually don't lose a sale. There are some teams that still at this quarter, they've got 1 or 0 web support staff. And that is a little bit dangerous because you leave the whole responsibility to all of these guys, web sales assistants or managers that are doing all the job, but when they're on the phone or doing something on the computer, they miss the opportunity that one person was requiring a very quick explanation, very brief explanation about our other models. So it's very important that you have some presence there. The web traffic, this is really good, and especially if you've got a chief operating officers that do a little bit of arithmetics, I will advise you that you tell him or tell her to actually focus some effort into this. So these kind of curves are really indicating you what is the specific amount, perhaps closer to the optimal, to have an optimal decision in this case. So if you want to invest in this improvement for the web traffic, for each of the issues that you mentioned above, try to take a look. Do I need to invest $500,000 for 7% increase? $500,000. That is too much. So I will say I take my decisions in the most optical. This is decision making with not uncertainty. So the graphs are telling me that if I invest 100,000 in improving the site appeal, or that search engines I can actually advertise my computers, then for each of the issues, you can see the gain that you may have. So for instance, if you go for the pink one, that is contract with major electronics website, well, that doesn't mean that it's giving you too much revenue or advantage. But if you focus on the contract with major search engines for your product to appear in there, well, if you invest 100,000, you will have a potential improvement of 25%. But if you invest another $300,000 more, the improvement is marginal, is little. So I will invite you that you take a look at these indicators and then make sense of them, and then trying to see where do you need to invest if you've got money. Okay. Remember, most of these, specifically in quarters 6, 7, and 8, web traffic is the swing towards overpassing your face-to-face sales. So I will advise you that you consider to invest on that. Okay. Again, web productivity is closely related to the salaries you pay to your staff, and to what extent, what are the technical features that actually make you sell much more on the website. And needless to say, in most of the winning teams in previous years, that plays a key role when you have focus importance on this specific factor of web sales. It's very, very important. Okay, so another issue that is perhaps becoming increasingly not worrying, but that you need to put attention to is the manufacturing. In the manufacturing, you've got your projected demand. Take a look at a specific demand per employee for the sales people that you're employing, and then the final one. Try to see. I mean, in quarter 5, we examine with a little bit of arithmetics formula how do you can calculate the net demand. That is important. Still, students cannot do those calculations or don't allow the team member to actually make the contribution towards a more accurate net demand, and they started to go over the top, ignoring all of these calculations, and then at the end of the quarter, you've got massive lost sales or high stock because you didn't actually manufacture what the customer needs were telling you. Okay, that's a massive mismatch. And I will invite you that you revise that. It's constantly changing, and then you need to observe that. Take a look at this example of this team. It started with probably two brands. They put it off. They continue experimenting with other two. Didn't work. And then they have created a new set of brands that they try to sell. And then these numbers, as you can see, all of you, very conservative. In quarter 7, those figures are conservative. So I will invite you that you take a look at that. I need to go to the strategic planning. Something that you need to revise is, although we're not using it, Pat and I, as a way to assess you, I will invite you that you cross-check this section to see what are your priorities. Because some students have not, some teams have not yet changed those priorities that are changing quarter to quarter. They are with priorities that were used in quarter even 3 or 4. That has changed dramatically at this time of the game. Yep.
Something that I didn't realise until a couple of years ago is that when the game calculates your 2 main markets or 2 main market shares on your scorecard, it works out what your main markets are by that. So let's say you say your main markets are Innovator and Mercedes, okay, and actually you've moved away from those and doing something else. It's going to look at that and say your market share is really small, but that's because you listed that as the ones that you want to be better, the first and the second. So just make sure that that is consistent with your plan as it evolves through the game. Otherwise, it's going to be measuring on the wrong thing.
Yeah. So as the cumulative balance score, if you got your priorities wrong, the multiplication effect that is calculating your balance scorecard, it will do the things incorrectly because it's based on that information you've got there. Try to update it to the moment that you're experiencing. Okay, in quarter 7, these specific brands or these specific segments are the ones giving me the money and the revenue. Okay. Go back to manufacturing and quality improvement. So this team, yeah, is increasing to 74 compared to, oh no, this is Glencoe. So yeah, 74 is going just above the specific sweet point to increase in terms of the quality, but it's not yet the best. You can still improve. But there are a couple of issues here. So you can obviously take a look, what are the key issues in your quality for manufacturing your computers? And then you say, well, I created a quality inspection. There's a study of variance that another company external to the company has done for us. a source story identifying what are these problems are, where are they coming from? Yes, they have you have bought them specifically. This team has already bought all of that information. Great. But the key issue is to do actions in order to tackle those issues. Is you buy your market research every quarter, hopefully, in order that you take better decision making. So you do actions to focus in specific regions, market segments. The same with quality control. So you buy the analysis from another company, you pay for it, but then you need to do something in order to tackle the issue, and that means that requires investment. So this team has invested in hard drive, the minimum expenditure that the game is telling you an indication how to do it, or the minimum how much you need to invest, and then how much do you want to really sort out the problem with your computers, and then you started to invest on these issues. That is the final part of the analysis. It's not enough to have the information, you need to actually implement it in your manufacturing or your plant. It's very important. In this case, these guys decided only to focus on hard drive and monitor, perhaps looking at the customer needs, that the problems with the computers were identified with these two factors. But you need to just go back and cross-check what are the key issues in terms of reliability judgment that you may have. Yeah, in this case, it was hard drive was not the highest. In fact, it was monitor and computing power. But they decided to focus on hard drive and monitor. If I were probably them, I will focus a little bit of investment in computing power, because that is affecting the high cost on repairing your computers. So try to assess carefully where do you need to put the money. It's not as a matter of, oh, I've got 1 million, distributing like crazy billionaire. No, you need to be intelligent to put the money where it's needed. Improvement, and now finance. Come on. I don't know. It's probably we moved the. Now it's gone. Again, for those students who have not yet done it, we will invite you that you consider the long-term and the conventional bank loan. So this team has already used them in previous quarter. Conventional and long-term. I don't know how to convey it. It's when you use money that is not yours, but you use it carefully, that provides an indication for growth. But if you use it as the typical example I do, if you use that money to buy Mercedes-Benz to your wife or your partner, then things started not to get into place, okay? Try to invest in areas, and with more information and decision-making shared within the team members, you can actually take the key decisions that actually will do better for your company. So please bear in mind, I need to encourage you to do that. Several teams have told me, oh, but that is not my money. They're afraid of that. And one thing that you need to learn as students is that here in this protected environment, you can do mistakes. Try to do those mistakes here. Try to feel how does it feel to actually borrow money that is not yours. Because outside in the real world, it's changing. I remember the first time I had a mortgage, my legs were actually shaking. It's like, oh my God, I'm in debt with that. Oh, and I did it. And then after a while, I say like, yeah, that is okay. But you need to have that experience. And then if you have it as a student, then it's a closer experience that in the real world, how does it feel when you borrow in the real life in your companies? That is just, dividends is something I need to, if you're doing fantastically well, and obviously if you have received in previous quarters $9 million, yeah, come on, to use this dividend part has an effect in the calculation of your balance scorecard. So if you got some money to spare, you're doing fantastically well this quarter or the next quarter, I will invite you that you may consider the option of dividends, because help in the multiplicatory effect in the calculation of the balance score. So when you go to performance report, balance scorecard, and then let me see. Yeah, it must be in well. Well, here, dividends. So these guys have 0, but if you've got a value, something that students cannot perceive correctly is the multiplicatory effect. So if that is 0, 1 times 0, 0. 1 times 0.01 is not 0. So it started to increase, multiplicative, multiplicatory effect, it multiplies depending on how much or what number do you put in them. So, and for any indicator, the more you use or do something has an effect on that. And I told you from Q5 that if one of your team members can actually focus on try to see where you can put money or a number there or change that situation, that will have a multiplicative effect in your balance scorecard. And finally, I will focus on something new this quarter. It's about the SPIF. Oh, sounds very funny. SPIF with another word in English. Anyway, so this is just to remind you, try to pay correctly your workforce, and then you'll start to see the productivity. AT started to grow, but I will invite you that you put those numbers higher if you can. And something that is changing in this quarter is industry production worker compensation. What is it? It must be here. Here they are, compensation. Well, I cannot see it in this game. When you've got the two aspects of bonuses and this SPIF. Oh, yeah. Okay. Here it is, a special sales program. So this one, some of the people, the game call it a SPIF, that is, what is it? Sales Performance Investment Fund. That is a way to actually give more either gifts or bonuses to your employees, and then that increase productivity. That is something new that is only coming up in this quarter. So in giving a good package, holidays, yeah, and so forth, but also these gifts and vouchers and coupons that actually make an influence to your workforce. And obviously, if you train them properly, that would be very good. The training has got a short life impact. So normally it's around 1 or 2 quarters. So I will invite you that you consider investing on these in a quarter when it's the final, and then you see the most effect of your bonuses or free or training for employees. Okay, try to do that way, because then later on they just move off, disappear off. But the first one, the contest program, increases the productivity of the staff considerably, and then they fall down. Either Q7 in 6 to 7, or try to see it in next quarter, and then you can see 1 quarter effect that this impact will be most likely seen. Okay, don't forget about that. It's quite important. And obviously, the bonuses and coupons that we have already, they call it free gift. So basically, they're just as a way of performing better, you give these free gifts or vouchers. And that's it.
QR code, I think.
Oh, yeah. How do you get it done? How you go to timetable? So in the meantime, that Pat is preparing the QR code, I can just address some of the questions you may have.